He stood up. That's the part nobody talks about. 3,000 people in that arena. Cameras rolling. Journalists with notebooks open.
Chuck Norris standing at a microphone at the center of the Long Beach Memorial Arena, saying something that made the entire crowd go quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't happen in a room of 3,000 people unless something has gone very, very wrong.
And in row 3, 6 feet from the aisle, a man stood up. He didn't rush the stage. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He just stood up, slowly, the way a person stands up when they have decided something, when the decision is already made and the body is just catching up to what the mind finished 10 seconds ago. Chuck Norris saw him. The crowd saw him. And every single person in that building understood, in the same instant, exactly who that man was and exactly what was about to happen. My father was standing near the back wall when it happened. He told me this story once, just once, the way he told the stories that mattered. He told me where he was standing. He told me what he heard. He told me what he saw in row 3. And he told me what happened on the drive home, alone in his car, when he finally let himself think about what he'd witnessed. I'm going to tell you everything he told me. All of it. But you need to understand where we are first. You need to understand the room. Long Beach, California. October 1971. The arena sat 2 blocks from the water. On a night like that, warm, dry, the Santa Ana winds just beginning to stir from the east, you could smell the Pacific from the parking lot. 6 blocks, maybe 7, but the smell carried. Salt and something underneath it, something older, the way ocean air has a bottom note that hits you in the chest before your brain registers it as a scent. My father parked 3 streets over and walked. He always walked when he covered events. He said it was the only way to arrive in the right state of mind, not rushed, not still sitting in traffic with the radio on, not carrying the last 40 minutes of the freeway in your shoulders. Walking lets you arrive as a witness. That's the word he used. Witness. Not a journalist, not a spectator, not a professional with a press badge. A witness. He got there 40 minutes before the evening session started. The Long Beach International Karate Championships had been running since 1964. Ed Parker started them. Ed Parker, who was the father of American Kenpo Karate, who had trained Elvis Presley, who understood that the martial arts in America needed a showcase, needed a stage, needed a moment every year where the best gathered in one place and let the world see what was happening. By 1971, that stage was this arena. 3,000 seats. A main competition floor the size of a basketball court, with a raised platform in the center and a judge's table running the length of the near side. Overhead, the lights were tungsten warm, yellowed, the kind of light that makes everyone look like they're inside a photograph from a decade ago even while you're standing in it. The scoreboards were manual, operated by 2 men in white shirts at a folding table near the exit. The public address system was 2 speakers mounted on poles at opposite ends of the floor, and when they were both on, there was a half-second echo. You heard everything twice, the second time slightly softer and from a different direction. My father found his spot along the back wall and stayed there. He knew this crowd. He had been covering this world, the world of American karate, tournament karate, the specific subculture of gyms and rankings and interstate rivalries, for 3 years by then. He knew the names. He knew the faces. He knew which schools sent the most students, which instructors had been feuding for years over lineage and technique, which fighters had real ability and which ones were coasting on reputation. He also knew who was competing tonight. And he knew who was not competing but was somewhere in that building. Chuck Norris was 31 years old in October 1971. born in Ryan, Oklahoma.
Grew up poor, genuinely poor, not the romantic American poverty that gets cleaned up in retrospective profiles, but the kind where the options at the end of each month are real and narrow and unpleasant. His father drank. The family moved. He was quiet as a kid, by most accounts, not withdrawn exactly, but interior. The kind of quiet that comes from spending a lot of time watching and not much time being noticed. He joined the Air Force at 17. Was stationed in Korea. That's where he encountered Tang Soo-do, the Korean martial art that would become the foundation of everything. He trained under a Korean instructor named Jae Chul-shin, and something locked into place.
This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't fitness. This was the thing. He came back to the United States with a black belt and a plan. By 1964 he was competing. By 1967 he was winning. By 1968 he had the title, the Professional Middleweight Karate Championship, which in the American karate world of that era was the closest thing there was to an undisputed crown. He held it from 1968 through 1974, the year he retired undefeated. 6 years. Undefeated. 230 wins. My father had interviewed him twice.
Once in Dallas, 1969, after a tournament where Norris won 3 divisions in a single day, something that at the time was considered nearly impossible, the physical output required to fight at that level across that many matches, the mental focus required to stay sharp through the afternoon into the evening with your body already running on fumes.
My father asked him how he did it.
Norris said, "You don't think about the next match until the current match is over.
The moment you start fighting the next fight in your head, you lose the one in front of you." My father wrote that down.
He said it was the most useful thing anyone told him that year, and not just about fighting.
The second interview was at Norris's school in Torrance.
My father went on a Tuesday morning, regular class day, and watched Norris teach for an hour before they sat down to talk. What he remembered from that hour wasn't anything specific that was said, it was the way Norris corrected his students.
No demonstration of ego. No performing for the new person in the back.
When a student's technique was wrong, Norris moved it into position with his hands, said 3 words or fewer, and moved on. The next time around the room, the technique was better.
Not perfect.
Better. That's teaching. The evening session at the 1971 Long Beach Championship started at 7. The first 2 hours were standard tournament competition, forms, sparring, breaking. The crowd responded the way tournament crowds respond. The breaks got applause, the sparring got tension and occasional sharp reactions when something landed or something nearly landed. The forms got a respectful quiet that was a different kind of attention than the noise.
My father watched from the back wall and took notes.
He was there for a specific reason. That night, he had an assignment, a piece he was writing for one of the California-based martial arts publications, a survey of the state of American karate at the start of the 70s. Where the art had come from in the last decade.
Where it was going.
Who the major figures were.
What the next generation looked like.
He had his notebook.
He had his pen.
He had his spot by the wall where he could see the whole floor. What he didn't have, at that point, was any expectation that the night was going to become a story he would tell for the rest of his life. At approximately 9 o'clock, he was never certain of the exact time. He said the clocks in arenas are always wrong. There was a break in the competition. These breaks were standard.
Equipment needed to be reset. Judges needed to be rotated.
The PA system needed a few minutes of music while the next round was organized. People in the crowd stretched, talked, went to get food from the concession stand near the east entrance.
A microphone was set up at center floor.
This was also standard. During breaks, there were often brief addresses from tournament organizers, acknowledgments of sponsors, announcements about the schedule for the following day. The kind of administrative housekeeping that a crowd of 3,000 needed to function.
Chuck Norris walked to the microphone. My father said the crowd responded immediately. Not a roar, something more specific than a roar. A collective focusing of attention, the sound of 3,000 people turning in the same direction at the same moment, the shuffle and murmur of a crowd reorganizing itself around a new point of interest. Norris was wearing a dark karate uniform. Tournament patches on the sleeve. He walked to the microphone the way he did everything, without hurry, without performance. He adjusted the stand, looked out at the crowd for a moment, and began to speak. My father was too far back to hear him clearly without the PA system. Through the speakers, that half-second echo, the warm arena acoustics, Norris's voice came through even and measured. The way it always came through. He was talking about the history of the tournament. About Ed Parker's vision. About what it meant that fighters from a dozen countries were in this building tonight. Standard remarks. Appropriate remarks. The kind of thing that the crowd expected and half listened to while settling back into their seats. And then someone in the crowd asked a question. My father didn't see who asked it. He was at the back wall, the lights were on the floor, not on the audience, and the question came from somewhere in the middle of the seating section, maybe row 12, maybe row 15. A man's voice, amplified by the PA or just by the acoustics, carrying to the back of the room. He asked about Bruce Lee. Now, you have to understand something about Bruce Lee in October 1971. He was not yet what he became. The films Enter the Dragon, the film that made him a global icon, the film that people today think of first when they hear his name, that film wasn't released until 1973. In October 1971, it hadn't been made yet. It was still in the future. What existed in October 1971 was The Big Boss, a Hong Kong film that had just been released in Asia a few weeks earlier, in October 1971, to extraordinary response. But it hadn't reached American theaters yet. Most of the people in that arena had not seen it. What they knew was the television show. The Green Hornet. 1966, 1 season, 26 episodes. Bruce Lee played Kato, the driver, the sidekick, the supporting character. The show was canceled after 1 season. By conventional Hollywood logic, that should have been the end of it. But the martial arts community had noticed something. The community, the specific community in that arena, the people who spent their lives in gyms and at tournaments, who understood what they were looking at when they watched someone move, had noticed that Kato moved differently than anything they had seen on American television. Differently than anything they had seen, period. The speed was different. The structure was different. Something in the way force was generated and delivered was different. Word had been circulating for years. Not in newspapers, in gyms. Instructor to student, practitioner to practitioner, the underground telegraph of a world that ran on personal connection and first-hand testimony. Some of it was admiring. Some of it was skeptical. Some of it was the particular skepticism that emerges when someone is doing something you don't entirely understand and your ego has a stake in the question. The question in that arena, the question the man in the crowd asked Chuck Norris, landed in the middle of all of that. My father heard it clearly. He told me the exact words. What do you think about Bruce Lee? Could he really fight? The arena went quiet. Not immediately, the way a room goes quiet is never immediate.
It happens in a wave, the closest people first and then the sound dying back through the crowd like water draining from a bathtub. But within 4 or 5 seconds, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight. The kind that a crowd produces when it understands that the next thing said is going to matter. My father said he felt it at the back wall. He said he had covered enough events, enough moments when a room collectively decided something was important, to recognize the feeling. It was physical. A change in the air pressure of the room. Almost. Not literally, he knew that wasn't literal, but that was what it felt like. The room pressing in slightly, leaning forward collectively, deciding to pay attention. Norris stood at the microphone. He didn't answer immediately. My father said it was perhaps 3 seconds, which in front of a quiet crowd of 3,000 people is a long time. Long enough to be a choice. Long enough to say, I'm not answering this carelessly. And then he answered. I need to be careful here. My father told me what Norris said that night. He told me the substance of it, the content, the position, the specific thing that made the room react the way it reacted. But he was at the back of a large arena, hearing through a PA system with an echo, 30-some years before he told me this story. The exact words, the specific phrasing, those I cannot give you with certainty. What I can give you is what my father gave me, the meaning, the position, and the reaction. Those 3 things I am certain of. Because he told me the same way twice. And the parts he told me the same way twice are the parts I'm giving you now. Norris began by saying something that acknowledged the question was fair. That Bruce Lee was someone worth talking about. That the question of Bruce Lee's actual ability, his fighting ability, his ability to perform under real pressure against real resistance, was a question that serious practitioners of martial arts had a legitimate interest in. My father said those first 20 seconds were standard. The kind of framing you do before you say something complicated. Then Norris said what he actually thought. He said that Bruce Lee was, without question, one of the most extraordinary physical specimens he had ever encountered. The speed. The conditioning. The obsession with training, the dedication to the physical work, the hours, the refinement of every movement down to fractions. In those respects, Norris said, there was no one quite like him. But that word landed in the room before everything else. My father said he heard the crowd absorb it, the slight collective intake, the adjustment of posture, the understanding that a qualification was coming. Norris said, tournament fighting is a specific thing. Point fighting, the format that dominated American karate competition in 1971, where you score a point with a controlled technique and stop, reset, score again, that format tests specific skills. Timing. Distance management. The ability to enter and exit cleanly and quickly. And in those skills, the people he had competed against, the fighters who had come up through the tournament system, had been tested in ways that were public and verifiable. Bruce Lee had not competed. Norris was careful. My father said he was careful to say this not as an accusation but as a fact. Bruce Lee had trained since childhood. Had studied under Wang Shunliang and Ip Man in Hong Kong. Had developed Jeet Kune Do, his own system, his own philosophy of combat, one of the most intellectually serious approaches to martial arts that Norris said he was aware of. None of that was in question. But the question asked was, could he really fight? And Norris said, and this is the part my father leaned forward when he told me, this is the part where his voice changed. Norris said that could he really fight is a question that only gets answered one way. Against resistance. Against someone who is trying to stop you. In front of people who can see what happens.
And that test, Norris said, Bruce Lee had not taken. Not in public. Not on record. Not anywhere that could be verified. My father said the crowd's reaction was not agreement or disagreement.
It was something more unsettled than either of those. The sound of 3,000 people processing something that was technically reasonable and that nonetheless felt, to many of them, like it had gone wrong somehow.
Like a correct answer to the wrong question.
Like the math was right but the proof was missing a step.
Because there was something Norris had not said.
Something the crowd knew, or had heard, or had carried in that underground telegraph from gym to gym for years. Something about a conversation that had already happened between these two men.
Something about what Norris knew, what Norris personally knew about Bruce Lee's ability. And that something was sitting in the room. My father felt it at the back wall.
He scanned the crowd. He was looking for something specific, the particular kind of stillness that a person produces when they are deciding whether to act. The held posture. The slightly too controlled stillness of someone who has gone very quiet on purpose.
He found it in row 3. Let me tell you what my father knew about Bruce Lee.
Not what everyone knows now, the mythology, the icon, the posters, the films that have been watched 1 billion times in every country on earth. What my father knew in October 1971, as a person who covered martial arts professionally in California. He knew that Bruce Lee had come to the United States in 1959. 18 years old, from Hong Kong, carrying a style called Wing Chun and a way of thinking about combat that was already, at 18, more systematic and more questioning than most people twice his age would ever manage. He knew that Lee had opened schools in Seattle, then Oakland, then Los Angeles. That the schools were controversial. Lee taught anybody who wanted to learn, regardless of ethnicity, which in the martial arts culture of the early 1960s was not the accepted approach.
The traditional schools taught within ethnic communities. Lee's schools were open. This created friction. He knew about the fight.
In 1964, the same year Ed Parker started the Long Beach tournament, Bruce Lee had been challenged by a faction of the San Francisco Chinese martial arts community. The challenge was formal and specific: stop teaching non-Chinese students, or face a representative of the community in a private match. If Lee lost, he would stop teaching. He did not stop teaching.
The match happened. My father knew people who claimed to have been in the room.
He had never been able to verify the accounts directly, too many versions, too many years between the event and the telling. But the consistent elements across every account he'd heard were these.
The match lasted less than 3 minutes. Lee won.
And Lee was not satisfied with how he won. That last part is the part that matters. That last part is the part that unlocks everything that came after: the obsession with efficiency, the development of Jeet Kune Do, the 10,000 hours of recorded training notes, the conviction that whatever he had been doing before that fight was not enough and needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. A man who wins and thinks he failed is a more dangerous person than a man who wins and thinks he succeeded.
My father understood that.
He had written about it, not about Lee specifically, but about the psychology of fighters who drive themselves beyond what their results require.
He knew something else.
He knew that in 1967, at the Long Beach Championships, Bruce Lee had given a demonstration. Not a competition, a demonstration.
Lee was not entered as a competitor. He was there as a demonstrator, showing techniques from Jeet Kune Do. And the people who had seen that demonstration, my father had talked to several of them, described it in terms that people in the martial arts community did not use lightly. Terms like nothing I have ever seen before and I don't know what I just watched, and, from one instructor who had been training for 25 years, if that is real, everything I know needs to be reconsidered. Those are not the words of polite compliments. Those are the words of people whose professional frameworks have been destabilized. So when Norris stood at the microphone and said, carefully, fairly, with appropriate nuance, that Bruce Lee had not been tested in public competition, my father understood why the room felt wrong. The question wasn't whether Lee had competed in point fighting tournaments. The question was whether the man was a fighter. And the people in that room, many of them, had opinions about that question that were not based on tournament records. They were based on other things. Witnessed things. My father said the silence after Norris finished lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then the crowd began to react, not uniformly. Not in the organized way of applause or disagreement, but the fractured, layered sound of a large group processing something controversial. Conversations starting. Arguments starting. The specific pitch of a crowd that has been given something to argue about and is beginning to do exactly that. Norris was still at the microphone. He hadn't moved. My father's attention was on row 3. Because in row 3, the man who had been sitting with that particular controlled stillness, the stillness of a decision already made, was no longer sitting. He was standing. My father said he almost missed it. That's the part that stayed with him, not the thing itself, but how close he came to not seeing it. He had been scanning the crowd for 30 seconds, maybe 40, moving his eyes along the rows the way you do when you're looking for something specific but don't know exactly what form it will take. Starting at the front and working back. Then starting at the sides and working in. Row 3 was close to the floor. Close enough that the people sitting there were inside the atmosphere of the event in a way that the people in row 20 were not. Close enough that when the lights were down and the competition was happening, they could see the fighters' faces. Close enough to hear things that the PA system didn't carry, the sound of contact, the breath, the specific acoustic of technique landing on a body. He found the man by his stillness. That's the only way my father could describe it. Everyone else in the crowd was moving, the small constant movement of 3,000 people reacting to what Norris had said, the leaning and shifting and turning to the person next to you and beginning to say something. The whole arena was in motion, the way a field of grass moves in wind, every element individually and all of them together. This man was not moving. He was sitting, at that point still sitting, with his hands on his knees and his back straight and his eyes on Chuck Norris at the microphone. Not the rigid stillness of someone suppressing something. Not the frozen stillness of someone in shock. The easy stillness of someone who has simply decided that movement is not required yet, and will be in motion when motion is required, and sees no reason to perform anything in the meantime. My father said, I knew immediately. Before I consciously identified who it was, some part of my brain that processes movement and stillness separately from the part that processes names and faces, that part already knew. He was compact. That was the first thing you noticed at distance in that light. Not small, not short, not slight, but compact in the specific way of a person whose physical dimensions are unified. Nothing extra anywhere. The kind of body that is entirely itself and nothing else. He was wearing street clothes. Dark jacket, if my father remembered correctly, he was never certain of the color. The tungsten light in that arena made everything amber. He was sitting in the 3rd row on the aisle side. And then he stood up. The standing happened in a single motion. My father said this carefully. He wanted me to understand the distinction. He had seen people stand up in crowds thousands of times, the segmented motion of it, the hands pushing off the armrests or the knees, the torso coming forward before the legs engage, the slight stagger of getting the balance right. The way standing up looks when you're sitting in a stadium seat that's been molded for a different body than yours. This was not that. This was one motion.
Seated to standing, uninterrupted, the way water moves from one level to another.
No visible effort. No sequence of segments. Just a resting state and then a different resting state, and the transition between them so clean that my father said his brain almost didn't register the movement itself, just the result. He was standing. The people around him, the people in row 3 on either side, the people in row 4 behind him, noticed immediately. Not because he made any sound or gesture. Because the quality of his stillness, which had been unusual when he was sitting, was extraordinary when he was standing. The people near him understood, with the same wordless below-language instinct that my father had felt from the back wall, that this was different from someone getting up to go to the concession stand. They moved away from him. Slightly. Without drama. The way people move when they sense that a space is going to be needed. Chuck Norris saw him. My father was watching Norris's face when it happened. He had shifted his attention from row 3 to the microphone to see how Norris was tracking the crowd's reaction, and he happened to be looking at Norris's face at the exact moment that Norris's eyes found the man in row 3. He said Norris's expression did not change. This is important. Not almost didn't change. Did not change. The same measured, even, composed expression that Norris wore through everything, through competition, through interviews, through a crowd of 3,000 people processing something difficult, that expression remained exactly what it was. But his eyes changed. My father said, it was like watching someone recognize a sound they had been expecting. Not surprise. Recognition. 3,000 people. Within 10 seconds of the man standing in row 3, the knowledge of what was happening had moved through the crowd like a temperature change. Not a wave, a temperature change. Simultaneous. Everywhere at once. The way a room becomes aware of something without anyone announcing it. My father heard the conversations around him shift. The people near him at the back wall, other journalists, some tournament staff, a few fighters who had finished competing and were watching the evening session, all of them went quiet within those 10 seconds. Not because anyone told them to. Because the room had changed and they felt the change and their instinct was silence. He heard a name, in a low voice, from somewhere to his left. Just the name. 2 syllables. The way you say a name when you're confirming something to yourself rather than announcing it to someone else. Bruce Lee. Now I need to stop here and tell you something. Because this is the part of the story where the history gets complicated. Where what my father saw and what the record says and what the legend became all start to move in slightly different directions, and I want to be honest with you about where those directions diverge. The 1971 Long Beach Championships are documented. There are photographs. There are accounts from journalists who were present. There is film footage, not much, and not high quality by any standard, but it exists. And in the documented record, certain things are clear. Bruce Lee was at the 1971 Long Beach Championships. He was not competing. He was not on the official program. He was there, as he had been at several Long Beach tournaments since 1964, as a presence. As someone the community knew and watched and talked about, regardless of whether he was formally entered in anything. What the documented record does not capture clearly is this specific moment. The moment with the microphone. The question about whether he could really fight. The standing in row 3. The photographs from that night don't show row 3 clearly. The accounts I've been able to find focus on the competition itself, the winners, the techniques, the notable performances. The moment my father described exists in the record only in the way many real moments exist, in the memories of the people who were there,
passed down in the imprecise and irreplaceable way that witnesses pass things down.
My father was a careful man.
He was not a person who embellished. His professional life was built on the distinction between what he saw and what he was told, between what was verified and what was claimed.
He knew that distinction better than most people. When he told me this story, he told me what he saw.
And what he saw, he told me the same way twice, 30 years apart.
I'm giving you that.
The man in row 3, Bruce Lee, because yes, that's who it was, you already knew, the room already knew, stood at the edge of his row and looked at Chuck Norris. He did not move toward the floor. He did not gesture. He did not, from what my father could see at the distance of the back wall,
say anything.
He simply stood there and looked at the man at the microphone, and the man at the microphone looked back at him, and the 3,000 people between them and around them and behind them understood that a conversation was happening that had nothing to do with words. My father said, I have been in a lot of rooms where two people were communicating something to each other that the room could feel but not hear. Boardrooms,
locker rooms, hospital waiting rooms.
But I have never been in a room where the communication was that clear to that many people simultaneously. It was like watching two people speak in a language that everyone present suddenly understood. He paused when he told me that. He said, I don't know if I can explain what they were saying to each other.
But I know what the room understood.
The room understood that Norris had said something about Lee's fighting ability, and Lee had stood up, and the standing was the answer.
Not an aggressive answer.
Not a challenge in the chest-puffed, jaw-forward way of men who need to perform aggression to feel it.
Something quieter than that and more certain than that. The standing said, I am here.
You said what you said.
I am here. Chuck Norris did not look away.
My father watched for this specifically, the looking away that a person does when they want to end a confrontation, the slight angle of the chin, the deliberate refocusing of the eyes towards something neutral.
Norris did not do this.
He held Bruce Lee's gaze from across the arena floor. And then something happened that my father said he had been trying to describe accurately for 30 years and was never quite satisfied with his description.
Norris nodded. Not a bow.
Not a formal acknowledgement of the kind that martial arts protocol demands.
A nod. Small, single, direct.
The kind of nod that moves a quarter of an inch and means 10 different things depending on the context.
My father said, in that context, in that room, it meant one thing. It meant, yes. You are right to stand up. I said what I said, and you are right to stand up.
Whether that's what it meant, whether that's what Norris intended, my father acknowledged he could not be certain.
You cannot read a nod from the back wall of an arena with perfect accuracy. You cannot know what is in a man's mind from the movement of his head. But that's what the room understood. The room understood the nod the same way. My father could feel it.
The exhale of 3,000 people, barely audible but present, the collective breath that a crowd releases when a tension resolves, even partially, even temporarily.
And then Bruce Lee sat down. My father wrote in his notebook.
He told me he looked at what he'd written and then he looked up at the floor where Norris was stepping back from the microphone, and he thought, this is the story.
Whatever else happens tonight, this is the story.
He didn't know yet how right he was.
Because the night wasn't over. Here is what you need to understand about the space between two people.
In martial arts, in any combat art, in any real understanding of how human beings engage physically, distance is not just geometry.
Distance is time. Distance is information. Distance is the entire field of what is possible and what is not possible in the next half second. 6 feet is a specific distance. 6 feet is the distance at which most hand techniques become possible but not automatic. At 6 feet, a committed step and extension puts you inside someone's guard, but the commitment is visible, the preparation takes time, the defender has a window. At 6 feet, you can see someone's hands and their eyes simultaneously. You can read the shoulder before the arm moves. You can be ready. 6 feet is also the distance at which you can see a person's face clearly. Not just the expression. The face itself. The eyes in particular, the thing that fighters look at first, always, because the eyes tell you what the body is about to do a fraction of a second before the body does it. My father was not a fighter. He had never trained. He covered fighters the way someone covers a sport they love without having played it, with deep knowledge of the principles and genuine understanding of what they're watching. But without the physical database that only in the only way some things can be finished, directly, quietly, without an audience even when an audience is present. He saw Norris say something and Bruce Lee listened to it with the same quality of attention that my father had seen him give the competition floor from row 3. Complete attention. Nothing withheld, nothing performed. And then he saw Bruce Lee respond. And Norris listened the same way. My father said, whatever Norris said to him, Lee heard it. Whatever Lee said back, Norris heard it. That's the best I can give you. They heard each other. And then, my father said this part slowly. He said it the same way both times he told me. Bruce Lee demonstrated something. Not a full technique. Not a performance. Not the kind of demonstration he would give at tournaments for crowds. Something small. A single movement, maybe 2. The kind of thing you do when words aren't precise enough and your body is more articulate. My father said it happened in less than 2 seconds. He said, I was 25 feet away and I almost missed it because of the duration. There was before it and after it, and the it itself was so brief that my brain had to reconstruct it from the before and after to understand what had happened. He could not tell me what it was. He could describe the before, Lee standing at rest, hands at sides, weight centered, and the after, Lee standing at rest again, identical posture, nothing apparently changed. And he could tell me Norris's reaction. Norris was still for a moment after it happened. My father said, not the stillness of someone who hasn't processed something yet. The stillness of someone who has processed something completely and is now deciding what to do with the information. And then Norris said something. 2 or 3 words. My father could not read them. And Bruce Lee, for the first time that evening, in my father's observation, smiled. Not a large smile. Not a performance of happiness. The specific small smile of a person who has been correctly understood. My father said, if I had to translate that smile into words, and I've tried for decades, so I'm going to try again, I would say it meant, yes. That is what I was telling you. You got it. He stood there, 25 feet away, with his notebook in his hand and his pen not moving, and he watched the two of them for another 30 seconds or so. And then Norris extended his hand. And Bruce Lee took it. And they stood there for a moment, 2 men, 6 feet having collapsed to arm's length, 2 men who had been at some kind of distance from each other for however many years their world had kept them at that distance, and who had now, in the corner of an arena in Long Beach in October 1971, closed it. My father said, I wrote one thing in my notebook after that. He told me what he wrote. I'll tell you at the end. The handshake lasted maybe 3 seconds. My father timed it the way he timed everything, not with a watch,
but with the internal metronome that people develop when they spend years observing things that happen quickly and need to be reconstructed accurately afterward.
3 seconds. Maybe 4.
The grip, the hold, the release.
Clean. No performance in it. No lingering for the room's benefit. And then they separated.
Bruce Lee moved back toward the seating area. Norris moved back toward the officials' table near the center of the floor. The arena noise, which had continued during all of this, 3,000 people continuing to be 3,000 people regardless of what was happening in the corner, swallowed both of them back into itself.
My father stood at his 25-foot position for another moment.
He said he felt something that he didn't have a clean word for.
Not disappointment, the opposite of disappointment, actually. The feeling you get when something that should have happened, happened. When the world briefly organized itself correctly. He said the closest word he had was rightness, and he knew that wasn't quite it either, but it was the direction. He walked back to the wall. He opened his notebook.
And he tried to figure out what he had just witnessed.
The competition continued for another hour and a half. My father watched it. He took notes.
He wrote down names and techniques and scores with the professional automaticity of someone who has done a job long enough that it runs on a track below the level of conscious thought, leaving the upper mind free to work on something else. The upper mind was working on what he'd seen in the corner. He kept returning to the same question, not what happened but what did it mean? Because in his experience, the meaning of a moment was rarely obvious in the moment itself.
Meaning took time. Meaning required distance.
And in his experience, the moments that seemed to require the most distance before their meaning became clear were usually the moments that mattered most. This one, he was already certain, was going to require a lot of distance. He was right about that. It took him 30 years.
During the break before the final session, my father did something he rarely did at events. He talked to people.
Not for the story, not with his notebook open, not in the professional capacity that he usually maintained at tournaments. He put the notebook in his jacket pocket and walked into the crowd and just talked to people. The way you talk to people after something has happened and you want to find out if what you experienced is what other people experienced, or if you have constructed something in your own mind that doesn't match the room. He talked to 6 people over the course of about 20 minutes. He chose them deliberately, people he knew, people whose observations he trusted, people who had been in different positions in the arena and would have had different sightlines to what happened. What he found surprised him.
Not everyone had seen the corner moment.
Several people had been watching the competition floor when Lee moved from row 3, and had missed the 6 feet exchange entirely. A few knew that something had happened, had felt the room change, had noticed other people's attention shift, but hadn't been able to see it directly. But everyone, every single person he talked to had seen the row 3 moment.
The standing.
The held gaze.
The nod. And every single person described it differently.
The first person my father talked to was a man named Gerald. He never told me Gerald's last name, just Gerald, a middleweight competitor from a school in Pasadena who had fought in the afternoon session and placed second in his division. Gerald was standing near the East concession stand with a paper cup of coffee and the slightly distant look of someone whose body has been through a great deal and whose mind is still catching up.
My father asked him what he thought about the Norris at the microphone moment. Gerald said, Norris was right. You don't know if a man can fight until you've seen him fight. That's the whole point of this tournament. That's why we're all here. Fair enough. My father wrote it down in his mind, not on paper. Stored it.
The second person was a woman named Carol who ran one of the largest karate schools in the San Fernando Valley. She had been teaching for 12 years. She had been at the first Long Beach tournament in 1964. She had seen Bruce Lee's 1967 demonstration.
My father asked her the same question. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Norris knows. He knows what Lee can do. Everyone in this building who has been doing this for more than 5 years knows what Lee can do. That question, can he really fight, that's not a real question in this room. The people who are asking it are asking something else." My father asked her what they were asking. She said, "They're asking if they're allowed to acknowledge it. That's all. They need someone they respect to say, yes, this man is real. So they can say it themselves." The third person was an older Japanese instructor. My father knew him, had interviewed him once, but couldn't remember his name clearly when he told me this story. He called him Tanaka-sensei, acknowledging he might be misremembering, who had been in the martial arts world since before most of the people in that arena were born. He had trained in Japan before the war. He had seen things that the American karate world of 1971 had not yet conceptualized. My father asked him what he thought. Tanaka-sensei was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in English that was careful and precise, "Mr. Norris is a great champion. He has done what champions do. Mr. Lee is something else. Not better. Not worse. Something else." My father asked him to explain. He said, "Mr. Norris fights in the world as it is. Mr. Lee fights in the world as it should be. Both are necessary. Both are real. They are not in competition. They are not comparable. They are doing different things." My father wrote that one down. On paper, right there, opened his notebook and wrote it. The fourth and fifth conversations were shorter and less memorable, general opinions, general reactions, the kind of response that a controversial public statement generates in any crowd, a mixture of agreement, disagreement, and the large middle territory of people who are waiting to find out what the consensus will be before they commit to a position. The sixth conversation was the one that stayed with him. He found the man at the far end of the back wall, the same wall my father had been standing against all evening, but the far end of it, the end near the service entrance. The man was alone. My father didn't know him, hadn't seen him at previous tournaments, didn't recognize him from the circuit. He was perhaps 60 years old. Small, with the particular economy of movement of someone who had been training for so long that training had reorganized the body at a fundamental level. He was watching the competition floor with an expression that my father described as technical, not emotional, not enjoying the spectacle, but reading it the way an engineer reads a blueprint. My father asked him what he thought about the evening. The man didn't answer immediately. He kept his eyes on the floor for a moment. Then he said, "You saw them, in the corner." It wasn't a question. My father said yes. The man said, "What did you see?" My father told him. Briefly, the 6 feet, the exchange, the movement Lee made, Norris's stillness afterward, the handshake. The man listened without interrupting. When my father finished, the man said, "And what did you think it meant?" My father said he didn't know yet. The man nodded. He said, "That's the right answer." And then he said something that my father told me verbatim, the only verbatim quote in the entire story, the only thing he was certain enough of the exact words to reproduce. He said, "The question was never whether Bruce Lee could fight. The question was whether the people in this room were ready to understand what fighting is." Tonight, for maybe 30 seconds, they were ready.
That's more than most nights.
My father said, "Who are you?" The man smiled. He said a name that my father either didn't catch clearly or didn't remember clearly. He was honest about this. He said the noise level had gone back up and he wasn't sure he heard it right. And then the man walked away toward the service entrance and my father never saw him again. The final session of the evening ran until approximately 11 o'clock. My father stayed for all of it. He watched the late matches with the part of his mind that was trained to watch, tracking technique, tracking performance, writing the professional observations that he would turn into copy in the next 48 hours. The magazine piece. The Survey of American Karate at the start of the 70s. That was still his job. That was still why he was there. But underneath that, running parallel to it, was the other thing. The thing in the corner. The handshake. The 30 years of distance it was going to take before he understood it. He stayed until the last competitor left the floor. He stayed while the folding tables were collapsed and the manual scoreboards were wheeled away and the arena began its nightly process of becoming an empty room again. He had always done this, stayed to the end, watched the dismantling, because he believed that the way a space behaved when the event was over told you something true about the event itself. The Long Beach Memorial Arena in October 1971. At 11:15 at night, told him this: something had happened here tonight that was larger than the tournament. The tournament was real and the competition was real and the champions who had won their divisions tonight deserved every recognition they received. But something else had also happened. Something that wasn't in the program. He found Bruce Lee once more before he left. This was not something he planned. He was walking toward the exit, the main exit, the one that opened onto the parking structure side of the building, and Lee was in the corridor, talking to two men my father didn't recognize. Not a private conversation, an animated one, the kind that happens when someone is in the middle of explaining something they care about, the hands moving, the ideas coming faster than the words. My father slowed as he passed. He wasn't going to stop. He wasn't going to interrupt a conversation that wasn't his to interrupt. But Lee noticed him. Or noticed the slowing. And for a moment, just a moment, their eyes met in the corridor. My father nodded. The kind of nod that means, I was there. I saw it. I understand. Or at least, I am trying to understand. Lee looked at him for a fraction of a second longer than a stranger would. Then he went back to his conversation. My father walked to the exit. He pushed through the door into the parking lot. The warm October air hit him. Salt, ocean, palms in the distance, the noise of the freeway 2 blocks over. He stood outside the arena for a moment. Then he walked to his car. He had a 1968 Ford Galaxy. Dark blue, he always said, though my mother maintained it was more green than blue, and this was the kind of disagreement they had productively for 40 years. Dark blue or dark green. Big engine. The kind of car that felt substantial on the freeway, that transmitted the road without isolating you from it, that made you aware of the physics of motion in a way that later cars would design away. He got on the 405 heading north. It was 11:30. The freeway was not empty, it was never empty in Los Angeles, not even at 11:30 on a weeknight, but it was thin. Enough space between cars that you could settle into a lane and stay there. The kind of traffic where driving becomes almost meditative, where the car handles itself and the mind can go somewhere else. His mind went somewhere else. He told me he spent the first 20 minutes of the drive on the tournament itself. The professional part, working through what he'd seen, organizing it into the structure of the piece he needed to write.
who the standout competitors had been, what the state of American karate looked like from the vantage point of Long Beach in 1971,
where the art was going.
He was good at this. Good at the mental draft, the first pass organization that happened before he ever sat down at the typewriter. By the time he reached the interchange where the 405 met the 101, he had most of the piece organized. Then the professional part switched off, and the other part came on. He started with the question he had been circling all evening.
What had Chuck Norris actually said?
Not the surface of it, he knew the surface of it. He had heard it clearly through the PA system. The careful, nuanced, technically defensible position. Bruce Lee had not competed publicly, therefore his fighting ability could not be verified by the standards that the tournament world used to establish fighting ability.
That was the surface.
But my father had been a journalist for long enough to know that what people say in public is rarely the entirety of what they mean. Especially when they say it carefully. Especially when the care is visible, when the precision of the language is a little too obvious, a little too deliberate, a little too shaped. When someone is being very careful about what they say, they are usually being very careful about what they don't say.
What had Norris not said? My father drove north on the 101 and thought about this.
He had heard the question that was asked, could Bruce Lee really fight? He had heard Norris's answer, he has not been tested in public competition. But the question that the room had really been asking, the question underneath the question, was different. And Norris had answered that question too.
Not with words.
With the nod.
And then with what happened in the corner. The room's question, the real one, was, should we take Bruce Lee seriously? And Norris's answer, in total, across the entire evening, was, yes. But understand what you mean when you say seriously. My father thought about Carol's comment. They're asking if they're allowed to acknowledge it.
He turned this over on the drive north. He had written it down because it struck him as true when she said it, and it was still striking him as true now.
The karate world of 1971 had specific rules about legitimacy. Tournament performance was the currency. Wins and losses and rankings and titles, these were the things that determined where you stood in the hierarchy. Bruce Lee did not operate in that currency. He operated in something else. In the directness of his movement. In the intellectual rigor of his system. In the specific quality of attention that practitioners who trained seriously could not dismiss no matter how much some of them wanted to. In the thing that those witnesses from the 1967 demonstration had described, I don't know what I just watched, which is not the language of dismissal, which is the language of encountering something that exceeds the current framework. The karate world of 1971, my father thought, had not found a way to talk about Bruce Lee that fit within its own categories. And things that don't fit within a community's categories make that community uncomfortable in specific ways. Either you expand the categories, which is difficult and requires acknowledging that your categories were incomplete, or you challenge the thing that doesn't fit. You demand that it meet your standards. You ask, but can he really fight? Meaning, can he fight the way we define fighting? Norris had said, with precision, by our definition, he has not demonstrated that. And then Norris had, in the corner, demonstrated something else entirely. Had stood 6 feet from the man and had that exchange and had received that 2-second demonstration and had gone still the way you go still when information updates your model of the world. My father thought, Norris knows something he didn't say at the microphone. And then he thought, Norris knows that saying it at the microphone would have been the wrong place to say it. And that distinction, the distinction between what you know and where you say it, was something my father had a great deal of respect for.
He was somewhere near Thousand Oaks when he started thinking about the movement.
The 2-second thing that Lee had done in the corner.
The thing my father had seen the before and after of and had to reconstruct the middle from the evidence of Norris's reaction.
He did not know what the movement was.
He had not been close enough, and it had been too fast, and he did not have the physical training to have read it accurately even if he had been close enough and it had been slow enough.
But he thought about Norris's stillness afterward. That particular stillness. The processing stillness, not the shock stillness. The stillness of someone updating a model. My father had been a journalist for a long time.
He had been in rooms with a lot of skilled people, not just fighters, not just athletes, but scientists, musicians, engineers, surgeons.
People who operated at the far edge of human capability in their fields.
And he had noticed a consistent thing about the way serious practitioners responded to encountering someone at a level above their own.
It was not what the movies showed. The movies showed awe.
The gasping, the stepping back, the wide eyes.
The performance of being impressed.
What actually happened, what my father had seen in labs and operating rooms and recording studios and now on the floor of a Long Beach arena, was something quieter and more internal. A specific quality of attention.
A focused, absorptive stillness.
The body going quiet so that the mind could do the work of processing something important.
Norris had done that.
And what it told my father was this: whatever Lee had shown him in those 2 seconds, Norris had not seen it before. Or had not seen it at that precision before. Or had seen elements of it and not seen it assembled that way.
Something had been new.
Something at the level of someone who had spent his entire career at the front edge of his field, who had 230 competitive wins, who had spent 6 years undefeated, who was by any reasonable measure one of the best fighters in the world, had been new.
My father drove north through the dark and thought about that for a long time. He thought about what Tanaka-sensei had said. Mr. Norris fights in the world as it is. Mr. Lee fights in the world as it should be.
He had been turning this over since he wrote it down. It was the kind of statement that sounded poetic and possibly empty, the kind of thing that gets said in martial arts contexts and means nothing specific. He had heard a lot of those. He was a journalist. He had professional skepticism toward beautiful sounding statements that don't cash out into concrete meaning. But this one kept cashing out. Norris in the tournament world, the world as it is, had spent 6 years building the most efficient possible version of himself within the rules and categories that defined competition in that era.
Point fighting. Controlled techniques.
The specific physical vocabulary of American sport karate in the late 60s and early 70s. He had mastered that world so completely that he was undefeated within it.
The world as it should be. What did that mean for Bruce Lee? My father thought, it means that Lee started from a different question. Not how do I win within this system, but what should this system actually be? Not how do I optimize my technique within the existing framework, but is the existing framework the right framework?
And the answer Lee had arrived at after the 1964 fight, after the years of systematic reconstruction, after Jeet Kune Do, was that no existing framework was the right framework.
That the map was not the territory.
That every style, every system, every set of rules was a human construction, useful in some respects and limiting in others, and the serious practitioner's job was not to master any particular map but to develop the ability to navigate the actual territory. Which is a much harder thing.
And a much lonelier thing. Because you can't have a tournament for it. You can't rank it. You can't give it a title. You can't point at a record of wins and losses and say, see, this is what this ability is worth. You can only demonstrate it in corners, in private, in the 2-second things that are over before most people know they happened, and that leave the people who did catch them standing still with their model of the world temporarily updated. He was past the 118 interchange, somewhere in the dark stretch of the 101 where the freeway runs through the hills, when the thing he had been approaching all evening finally arrived. It came the way the important things came, not as a conclusion, not as the arrival at a logical destination, but as the sudden presence of something that had been in the room all along and that he now, finally, had the right angle to see. He thought about what he had witnessed. Not the tournament. Not the competition. The thing underneath it, the specific human drama of two men who represented something larger than themselves, in a room full of people who had devoted their lives to understanding physical excellence, working out something real between them and the corner while the crowd watched the floor. And he thought about what it cost. What it cost Norris to say what he said at the microphone, knowing, as he clearly knew, that the man he was discussing was in the room. Knowing that the room would register the gap between the public statement and whatever private, even when consistent application put him at an awkward angle to something he privately knew. That was integrity of a kind. A limited kind, maybe. A kind that had blind spots and costs. But a kind. And what it cost Lee to stand up. My father thought about that. The standing. The decision to make yourself visible in a room of 3,000 people, without aggression, without performance, without the chest-forward theater of a challenge, just the simple physical fact of standing up and being seen. That required something too. Not the absence of ego, the man had ego. Every serious practitioner at that level has ego. Ego is part of the mechanism, but the specific kind of confidence that doesn't need the room to validate it. That can stand up in row 3 and hold a gaze and say, with the body, with pure presence, I am here. You said what you said. I am here. And then sit down when the point is made. Not waiting for acknowledgement. Not needing the crowd to react. Just making the point and returning to the seat. And what it cost both of them to do what they did in the corner. The closing of the 6 feet. The exchange. The 2-second thing. The handshake. My father thought neither of those men needed to do that. Norris had made his public statement and could have let it stand. Lee had made his standing up statement and could have let it stand. The crowd had its tension and its release and its argument to carry home. Everything could have ended at the nod. They chose to close the 6 feet. And closing 6 feet, choosing to be in the range where everything is visible, where there is no distance left to manage, where you cannot control what the other person sees in your face or your movement, that is always a choice. And it is always a choice that costs something. The thing it costs is the protection that distance provides. They paid that. Both of them. In a corner of an arena in Long Beach in October 1971, for no audience and no record and no history except a journalist at the back wall with a notebook who was going to drive home on the 405 and the 101 and think about it for 30 years before he told his son. He pulled off the freeway 2 exits before his usual one. He didn't plan to do this. His hands just took the exit. He drove through a quiet residential neighborhood, houses dark, the specific silence of a suburb at midnight, and ended up parked outside a park he sometimes walked through on weekends. He sat in the car with the engine off. The freeway noise was audible from there, the constant low presence of it, the sound of the city continuing to move even when everyone in it was asleep. He opened his notebook. He looked at the 4 words he had written in the corner of the floor. He sat with those 4 words for a while. Then he drove home. He didn't tell anyone about the corner moment for a long time. The piece he wrote for the magazine covered the tournament, the competitors, the techniques, the state of American karate in 1971. It was a good piece. He was always a good writer, clean and precise, the same qualities he admired in the fighters he covered. It was published a few weeks after the tournament and received the response that good pieces on niche subjects receive: appreciative attention from the people who care deeply and indifference from everyone else. He did not write about the row 3 moment. He did not write about the 6 feet or the corner or the 2-second movement or the handshake or the thing the man at the service entrance said. I asked him once why not. He said, because I didn't understand it yet. And I had a rule about writing things I didn't understand. The rule was, don't. I asked him when he understood it. He thought about that for a while. He said, 1993. I was watching one of his films with your mother, Enter the Dragon, I think, or maybe Way of the Dragon, and there was a moment where he moved a specific way, and I thought, that's what he showed Norris in the corner. That's what the 2 seconds was. And something clicked, and I understood the whole evening. I asked him what the 4 words in the notebook were. He told me. I'll tell you now. They were both right. There is a notebook. Not my father's notebook, a different one. One of Bruce Lee's notebooks. It is held now in an archive, and portions of it have been reproduced in books and documentaries, and if you have spent any serious time studying Lee's life and work, you have probably encountered fragments of it. But fragments are misleading. Fragments give you the impression of a collection of aphorisms, the kind of thing that gets printed on motivational posters, the kind of thing that sounds profound in isolation and gets shared on social media by people who want to seem thoughtful. Be water, my friend. That kind of thing. The notebooks in full are something different. They are the working documents of a systematic mind. Not a philosopher's mind, not the kind of mind that constructs abstract systems from first principles and tests them against other abstract systems. A practitioner's mind. A mind that starts from the body, from the specific physical problem of how a human being most effectively applies force to another human being in a context where that other human being is trying to prevent it, and works outward from that problem toward principles, and from principles toward philosophy, and from philosophy back toward the body again. It is a loop. A continuous loop, running in both directions simultaneously. My father understood this about Lee, understood it better after 1993, after the film and the click of recognition, but had been circling it since 1971. Since the drive home. Since the 4 words in the notebook. They were both right. Let me tell you what Lee was building. Let me tell you what the notebooks actually contain. Because you cannot understand the corner moment, you cannot understand the handshake, you cannot understand what Norris went still about, without understanding what Lee had been doing in the years between the 1964 fight and the October evening in Long Beach. Start in 1964. The fight in San Francisco. The challenge from the Chinese martial arts community. The match that lasted less than 3 minutes and that Lee won, and that Lee, against all rational expectation, against every ordinary human response to winning, considered a failure. Why failure? He won. By every external measure, he won. The other man quit. Lee held the floor. The community's demand, stop teaching non-Chinese students, was never fulfilled. He continued to teach whoever came to learn. He won. But here is what he said afterward, in various forms, to various people, over the following months and years. He said the fight had taken too long. He said he had expended too much energy.
He said that at points during the fight, he had felt his technique collapsing, not failing exactly, but losing the structural integrity he had trained it to have, becoming effortful in ways that meant the efficiency wasn't there.
3 minutes. He won.
And he thought, this is not good enough.
Think about the standard that implies.
Think about the gap between I won and this is not good enough and what it takes to live in that gap, to refuse the comfort of the win, to insist on holding yourself to a standard that your results don't yet require, to look at a victory and see in it the evidence of what you still don't know.
That gap is where Jeet Kune Do was born.
He spent the next 3 years, 1964 to 1967, dismantling.
That's the only word for what the notebooks from that period show. Not building. Dismantling.
Taking apart every assumption he had inherited about how combat worked, about what a style was and what it was for, about the relationship between training and actual application, about the role of forms in kata and structured practice in developing real ability. He studied boxing. Not casually, systematically. He watched film of the great boxers the way a scientist watches footage of a phenomenon he's trying to understand.
Ali.
Frazier.
The footwork. The weight transfer.
The specific geometry of the jab, the way it functions not just as a scoring technique but as a measuring tool, a rangefinder, a distractor that creates the conditions for what comes after.
He studied wrestling.
He studied fencing, the footwork particularly, the economy of forward and backward motion, the way the fencer manages distance as a primary weapon rather than a secondary consideration. He studied everything he could find about how human beings actually fight, not how they are trained to fight in formal systems, not how they fight in competitions with rules and judges, but how they fight when the context is real and the consequences are real and no instructor is present. And then, this is the part that the notebooks make most vivid, he started throwing things out.
Not the skills. The frameworks.
He threw out the idea that a style was something to belong to. The idea that the techniques of a system were correct because the system said they were correct. The idea that the goal of training was to become an excellent example of a category, an excellent Wing Chun practitioner, an excellent boxer, an excellent wrestler, rather than to become the most effective possible version of yourself as a fighter.
He said it many ways, in many notebooks, over many years, the style is a prison. The style is a fence.
The style says, these things are inside and these things are outside, and to be a practitioner of this style is to accept the inside and refuse the outside. And refusing the outside means refusing information. And refusing information means that your model of what fighting is will always be smaller than what fighting actually is. Jeet Kune Do, the name translates roughly as way of the intercepting fist, was not a style.
This is the thing that people who encounter it as a style miss.
It was explicitly, deliberately, by design, not a style.
It was a process. A method for continuing to question. A commitment to throwing out the fence whenever the fence appeared.
That is extremely difficult to do.
Because the fence is comfortable. The fence means you know where you are.
The fence means you have colleagues, a community, a lineage, a set of verified techniques that people before you have tested and handed down.
The fence means you belong to something. Lee threw it out anyway.
By 1967, when he gave the demonstration at the Long Beach Championships, the demonstration that left practitioners of 15 and 20 years saying, "I don't know what I just watched," what he had was this: a fighting system with no fixed techniques.
Not many techniques, no fixed techniques.
The technique that was appropriate was the technique that the moment required, generated from principles rather than from a library of preformed movements.
This is radically different from how martial arts training works in almost every other context.
In almost every other context, you train specific techniques until they are automatic, you build the library, and in application you access the library. The technique is there, preformed, waiting. Lee's system had no library.
It had principles.
It had the ability to generate appropriate responses in real time from those principles. Which means the training is entirely different. You are not drilling specific techniques to automaticity. You are developing the perceptual and physical intelligence to construct the right technique at the right moment from the available raw material.
That is a much harder thing to train. And a much harder thing to demonstrate.
Because a library of techniques is visible.
You can show it. You can perform it.
You can have students watch and have them see clearly what they are looking at.
What Lee was doing is largely invisible until the moment it's applied.
Until the moment of contact, of real resistance, of the specific configuration of a real opponent in real time, until that moment, it looks like very fast, very efficient movement.
It looks like exceptional physical capability. It looks impressive. It doesn't look like what it is. What it is only reveals itself in the 2 seconds. In the corner. In the specific moment when someone who has spent their entire career at the front edge of their field sees it applied and goes still. My father thought about the notebooks, had thought about them, had read what was available of them, had talked to people who had trained with Lee directly, and he had developed a specific theory about what Lee was building in those years between 1964 and 1971. His theory was this. Lee was not building a better fighting system. He was building a better question. The fighting system was the answer, or rather, it was the current best answer, the most recent iteration, the form the answer took as of this year, this month, this week. Tomorrow it might be different. Next year it would definitely be different. The system was always provisional, always subject to revision, always willing to be wrong about itself. The question was permanent. The question was, what is this actually? Not, what does my tradition say this is? Not, what do the rules of this competition define this as? But, underneath all of that, underneath the traditions and the rules and the categories and the politics, what is this? What is actually happening when two human beings engage physically? What are the real principles? What is the irreducible core? That question, my father believed, was what Lee was asking in the notebooks. Every day. From 1964 until 1973, when he died at 32. And the reason the man at the service entrance said what he said, the question was never whether Bruce Lee could fight, the question was whether the people in this room were ready to understand what fighting is, was because that question, Bruce Lee's real question, was not a question the tournament world had a framework for answering. The tournament world asked, who won? Lee's question was, what does winning mean? These are not the same question. And a room full of people whose professional and personal identity is organized around the first question will find the second question threatening in specific ways, ways that feel like dismissal, like arrogance, like the refusal to play by the rules. Ways that make you ask, from a microphone, but can he really fight? When what you actually mean is, I don't know what to do with what he's doing. There is a photograph from 1970. Lee in his garage in Bel Air, he had moved to Los Angeles by then, the house on Roscommari Road, the garage converted into a training space that people who saw it described in terms that made it sound less like a gym and more like a laboratory. Equipment everywhere. Bags, targets, weights, devices he had designed himself for specific training purposes. Notebooks on a table at the far end. In the photograph, he is standing at a heavy bag. Not hitting it, standing near it, looking at it, with the focused expression of someone who is thinking rather than working. One hand is raised toward the bag, not touching it. My father had a copy of this photograph.
He kept it in the file folder where he stored his notes from the 1971 tournament. He told me once that he looked at it whenever he wanted to remind himself of something specific.
I asked him what specific thing.
He said, the difference between practicing a thing and thinking about a thing.
Most people, when they're in front of the equipment, they're practicing. Working. Doing. He's thinking.
He's still working, the thinking is working, but he's asking the equipment a question.
You can see it in his face. He's asking, what are you, really? What are you for? What do I need from you that I haven't understood yet? He paused. He said, that's the photograph of someone who is never satisfied.
And I mean that as the highest possible compliment.
There is a story that almost nobody knows.
Not because it has been hidden, it hasn't been hidden, it's in the record. Pieces of it have been told in various books and interviews over the years. But it's in the record in the fragmented way that things exist in the record when they don't fit the main narrative. When the main narrative has already decided what the story is and the pieces that don't fit the main narrative get filed in the margins, in the footnotes, in the places where information goes to be technically available and practically invisible. The main narrative of Bruce Lee is this: the films, the icon, the legend.
The transformation of a human being into a symbol. The 32-year age at death, which is the age that turns people into myths. The cultural impact, which is real and vast and still unfolding 50 years later. That narrative is true. And it is incomplete. The incomplete part is the fighting. The actual fighting. Not the choreographed fighting of the films, extraordinary as that is, and it is extraordinary, and the people who worked with him on those films said consistently that the camera was a limitation, that what it captured was a fraction of what he was actually doing, that the speed had to be reduced for the camera to register it at all. The actual fighting. The private matches. The testing. The thing that Lee did, consistently, throughout his career in America, which was to seek out the best practitioners he could find in every style, every system, every tradition, and fight them. Not for record. Not for title. For information. This is the part the tournament world of 1971 didn't know how to account for. Because these fights were not public. They were not judged. They left no official record. They happened in gyms, in garages, in private training spaces. And the people who were in those rooms, the people who fought him, the people who watched, mostly kept quiet about it, for various reasons that I'll get to. But some of them talked. My father spent years collecting these accounts. Not systematically at first, not as a research project, not as something he intended to write. He collected them the way a person collects things that matter to them without yet knowing why they matter. A conversation here, a letter there, a phone call from someone who had heard he was interested. By the time he told me the Long Beach story, he had accounts from 11 people who either fought Bruce Lee in private or witnessed such a fight. 11 accounts. Over 30 years. From people in different cities, different styles, different communities, who had no reason to coordinate their stories and whose stories were nonetheless consistent in the same ways. I am going to tell you about 3 of them. The first account came from a man in Seattle. My father called him Raymond. I don't know if that was his real name. My father sometimes changed names when he wasn't certain of consent, but he told me the account was real and the person was real. Raymond had trained in Seattle in the early 1960s. He was there when Lee was running his school in the University District, one of the first students, one of the people who saw the earliest iterations of what would become Jeet Kune Do. He told my father about a session in 1963.
A private session, just a few people, in the back room of the school after regular classes had ended. Lee had been working on a specific problem, the problem of what happens when the other person is bigger than you.
Not abstractly bigger. Raymond was 6'2" and 220 pounds. Lee was 5'7" and 135 at the time. Raymond said Lee asked him to attack seriously. Not to cooperate. To actually try to take him down, the way you would if the situation were real. He said, I was 23. I had been training for 3 years. I was strong and I was fast, and I did not believe, with genuine certainty, that someone 5 inches shorter and 85 pounds lighter than me was going to stop me from doing what I intended to do. He said he learned something that night. He said, I don't know how many times I tried. 6? 8? I stopped counting. I never got close. Not close to hurting him, I never got close to making contact. Every time I committed to a movement, the space where he had been was empty. Not dodged out of, just empty. Like he had known before I committed that I was going to commit, and had already not been there. My father asked him to describe what it felt like from the inside. Raymond said, you know the feeling when you're very sure of something and then you find out you were wrong? That feeling, not the intellectual acknowledgement of being wrong, but the physical feeling, the sensation in your body when your certainty turns out to be misplaced? That. Over and over. 8 times. I was certain I had him, and then I didn't, and I couldn't tell you what happened in between. My father asked, what did you learn? Raymond was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I learned that speed is not what I thought it was. I thought speed was moving fast. He was showing me that speed is moving at the right moment. If you move at the right moment, you barely have to move at all. If you move at the wrong moment, it doesn't matter how fast you are. The second account came from a man in Los Angeles. A Thai boxing instructor, Muay Thai, one of the first serious Muay Thai teachers in Southern California, a man who had trained in Thailand and brought the art back to the United States in the late 1960s when almost nobody in America had heard of it. My father had known him professionally. Had written about him. Had interviewed him about the development of Muay Thai in American martial arts culture. This conversation was different. This conversation happened because my father, in 1975, had called to ask specifically about Bruce Lee. About whether this instructor had known him. There was a long silence on the phone. Then the instructor said, yes. I knew him. He told my father about a meeting in 1969. Lee had sought him out specifically, had heard about his background, had wanted to understand Muay Thai, had come to his school not as a student but as a peer who wanted to exchange information. That was, the instructor said, the only way to describe it, an exchange. Lee would show something from his system, the instructor would show something from Muay Thai, and they would work through the principles together. At some point the exchange became a sparring session. The instructor described it with the specific care of someone who has thought about how to describe something for a long time and has found the description that is most accurate. He said, I have trained for 25 years. I have trained with fighters in Thailand, real fighters, fighters who have fought hundreds of times, fighters who understand Muay Thai at the level that most Western practitioners never reach. I know what excellence looks like. I know the difference between excellent and exceptional. He paused. He said, Bruce Lee was not in any of my categories. My father asked what he meant. He said, I mean that the categories I had developed over 25 years of serious training and teaching were not adequate. When I tried to read what he was going to do, I was reading the wrong things.
I was reading the things that every other opponent had told me, with their body, before they moved. He was telling me different things. And by the time I understood that the things he was telling me were not the things I should be reading, the thing had already happened. My father asked, "What thing?" The instructor said, whatever he had decided the thing would be. I don't mean I was hurt. I mean I was behind. Every time. I was behind before I started. He was operating at a pace that was faster than my reading of the situation, and no amount of experience or technique changed that. And then he said something that my father wrote down verbatim in the margin of his notes. He said, the worst part, I say worst, I mean the most humbling part, was that he was not trying. You can feel when someone is trying. You can feel the effort. He was not trying. He was thinking. The third account is the one my father called the most important. It came from a man who had trained directly with Lee for 2 years in the late 1960s. One of the serious students, not someone who dropped in occasionally, not a celebrity who took a few lessons, but someone who was in the gym regularly, who participated in the serious training sessions, who was present when Lee was working on the hard problems and not performing for anyone. My father met him once, in person, in 1979. He told me about the conversation at length. It was the longest single account in his collection, the most detailed, the most considered. I'm going to give you the part that matters. My father asked him, what was it like to train with someone who was developing something entirely new? How did you know it was new? How did you recognize it as something that didn't exist before? The man thought about this for a long time. He said, you didn't recognize it immediately. That's the honest answer. In the beginning, it looked like very good Wing Chun, which is what he started from. Fast, efficient, clean. You thought, this is an excellent practitioner of a system I recognize. And then it started to not be that anymore. It was a gradual process. Over weeks and months, the things he was doing stopped fitting the patterns I had for Wing Chun. But they also stopped fitting the patterns I had for boxing, which he was studying seriously at the same time. Or for fencing. Or for wrestling. Things from all of those would appear, but assembled in ways that didn't come from any of those traditions. Assembled from first principles. Assembled from the question of what this specific moment requires. My father asked, when did you realize it was something entirely new? He said, there was a moment. A specific moment in a sparring session. He did something, a combination, a sequence of movements that I had no framework for. Not because it was fast, not because I couldn't track it. Because it was correct in a way I didn't have a word for. It wasn't correct according to any system I knew. It was correct according to something more fundamental than any system. And I thought, he's not working from a system. He's working from underneath systems. My father asked him what underneath systems meant. He said, it means the principles that all the systems are trying to express, imperfectly, incompletely, each one capturing a piece of the truth and calling the piece the whole. He was working from the whole. Or trying to. I don't know if anyone can actually work from the whole. I think it might be an asymptote, something you approach forever without arriving. But he was closer to it than anyone I had seen or have seen since. My father kept these accounts in the same file folder as the Long Beach notes. The photograph of Lee in the garage. The forward notebook entry. The accounts from 11 people over 30 years. He never published any of it. I asked him once why not. He said, because it's not that kind of story. It's not a story that belongs in a magazine. It's a story that belongs in a conversation between two people, where the person telling it can watch the other person's face and see when they understand something and slow down there and go faster in the places that are less important.
He paused.
He said, also, I wasn't finished understanding it myself for a long time.
I asked him when he finished understanding it. He said, I don't think you finish.
I think you arrive at a version that feels stable enough to live with. And then something happens, a film, a conversation, a moment, and it updates again.
And the updating is the point. That's what he was trying to tell people. That the updating is the point. There is one more thing I need to tell you about what Lee was building. My father found it in a published interview from 1971, the same year as the Long Beach tournament, a few months before. The interview was in a small publication, not widely circulated, the kind of thing that lives in archives and gets found by people who are specifically looking for it. Lee was asked, "What do you want people to take from your teaching?" He said, "I want them to stop looking for the answer in the teacher. The teacher can only point. The teacher can say, look in this direction, and look carefully, and don't look away just because what you see is uncomfortable. But the thing the teacher is pointing at, that's yours. That was always yours. I can't give it to you. Nobody can give it to you. All I can do is show you that it exists and that finding it is worth the work." My father read that interview in the summer of 1971. He read it twice. Then he put the publication down on his kitchen table and sat there for a while without picking it up again. He told me he had the specific feeling, the one he associated with reading something true, of his chest cavity changing size slightly. Not literally. Not physiologically. But the sensation of interior space expanding, the way a room feels larger when you open a window, the feeling of something that had been closed opening. He had been a journalist for a long time. He had read a great many interviews. He had developed, over years, a fairly reliable internal instrument for distinguishing between the things people said in interviews because they were true and the things people said in interviews because they sounded good. The two categories overlapped sometimes. Some things are both true and sound good, but they were distinct categories and the instrument usually worked. The instrument said, this is true. Not in the verifiable, sourced, footnoted way that journalism requires truth to be demonstrated. In the other way. The way that a thing is true because it describes something real about the structure of the world, something that your experience confirms even if your experience was accumulated without knowing that this was the confirmation you were building toward. He cut the interview out of the publication. He put it in the file folder. That file folder, the Long Beach notes, the photograph, the forward notebook entry, the 11 accounts, the published interview, sat in a drawer in his study for 30 years. I found it after he died. My father died in 2004. Pancreatic cancer. Fast, as it usually is, 4 months from diagnosis to the end, the 4 months moving at two different speeds simultaneously, too fast and not fast enough, the way time moves when you are waiting for something terrible and also trying to hold it off. He was 71. He had retired from journalism in 1998 not because he stopped caring about it, but because the publication he had worked for longest had changed in ways that no longer required what he was good at, and he was old enough and honest enough to recognize the change for what it was rather than fight it. He spent the retirement years reading, writing letters, walking, spending time with my mother in the particular quiet way of two people who have been together so long that they have developed a private language that operates almost entirely below the surface of speech. He told me the Long Beach story in 2002. We were sitting on his porch on a Sunday afternoon in September. My mother was inside. The light was the specific golden quality of California September light, the light that arrives in that month and no other,
the light that people who grow up in California carry in their memory is the definition of afternoon.
He just started talking. No preamble. No, I want to tell you something.
He was looking out at the yard and then he was talking, and I understood within the first minute that this was one of the important ones, one of the stories that are told once, in the right conditions, when the person telling them has decided that the time for the distance is over.
I didn't interrupt.
I didn't ask questions until he paused in places that were clearly designed for questions.
I just listened.
He talked for 2 hours. He told me everything I have told you here: the arena, the back wall, the row 3 moment, the 6 feet, the corner, the drive home, the accounts from the 11 people, the interview quote, the file folder, the 4 words. And then he told me one more thing.
The last thing. In February of 1973, 5 months before Bruce Lee died, my father got a phone call.
He was at his desk in the late afternoon. He always worked in the late afternoon, said his brain ran better after 3 o'clock, said the morning was for reading and the afternoon was for writing and the evening was for thinking about whether the writing had been any good.
He picked up the phone on the second ring.
The voice on the other end was one he recognized immediately, one of the people in his network, someone he had known for years, someone who existed at the intersection of the film world and the martial arts world that had been growing in Southern California through the early 70s.
The person said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to not write it yet." My father said, "Tell me."
The person said that Bruce Lee had recently completed a film. Not a Hong Kong film, an American film, the one that was going to change everything, the one that the American studio system had finally committed to after years of Lee building his reputation in Asia.
Enter the Dragon.
Shot in Hong Kong, completed earlier that year, scheduled for release in the summer.
My father knew about the film.
The martial arts community knew about the film.
The anticipation was real. But that wasn't what the person was calling about. The person said, "I've seen some of the footage. Private screening, not for release. And I need to tell you, what's on screen is not what he actually is. I don't mean it's bad.
I mean the camera cannot keep up. They had to film at a reduced speed and then speed it back up, and even that doesn't capture it. What I saw on that screen is a reduced, slowed, camera-adjusted version of what this man can do, and it is still the most extraordinary physical performance I have ever seen on film."
My father said, "I know." The person said, "No. You don't."
I'm telling you, when this film comes out, people are going to think they're seeing what he can do.
They're not. They're seeing a photograph of it. A still photograph. And that's fine, the film is extraordinary, it's going to change everything, I'm not criticizing it. I'm just telling you, the real thing is more. My father said, "I know that too." Silence on the phone. Then the person said, "How do you know?" My father said, "Long Beach. 1971, I was at the back wall." Another silence. Longer. Then the person said, "You saw the corner." My father said, "I saw the corner." The person said, "Then you already have the story." My father said, "I'm not ready to write it yet." The person said, "I understand. But write it eventually. Because the film is going to create a version of him that's easier than the real version. And the real version deserves to exist somewhere." My father thanked him. They talked for a few more minutes about other things, the state of the martial arts world, the upcoming tournament season, the usual professional exchange. Then they hung up. My father sat at his desk. He looked at the drawer where the file folder was. He did not open it.
He picked up his pen and went back to the piece he had been working on before the phone rang.
5 months later, Bruce Lee died. July 20th, 1973. 32 years old.
The cause: cerebral edema, a swelling of the brain. The specific physiological event that ended everything remains in some respects disputed, the subject of ongoing discussion in the medical literature and in the community that has devoted itself to understanding his life. What is not disputed is the fact and the date and the age.
32. My father heard the news on the radio in his car. He pulled over.
He sat on the side of the road for 20 minutes.
He told me he didn't cry, not immediately, not in the car. He sat there with the radio off, the traffic moving past him, the summer heat coming through the windows, and he thought about the corner. He thought about the 2 seconds. He thought about Norris going still. He thought about the handshake. And he thought, the real version is gone now. The camera version is all that's left. And the camera version is extraordinary, and it will outlast everything, and it will travel everywhere, and billions of people will see it and think they are seeing what he was. And they will be seeing a photograph. And the photograph is beautiful. And the thing the photograph was taken of was more. He told me this on the porch in September, in the California light, and his voice was even when he told it, the even voice of a man who has had 30 years to process something and has arrived at the stable version of it, the version he can live with. But I noticed his hands. His hands, resting on the arms of the porch chair, were very still. The particular stillness I had known all my life as the sign that something was costing him something. The stillness that meant, I am holding this carefully because if I am not careful it will be heavier than I can hold in the open. I didn't say anything about his hands. I just listened. He told me about the file folder. He described the contents, not the way I have described them here, in the detail I have given you, because the conversation on the porch was different from this, was more compressed, was a father talking to a son rather than a story being told to everyone. He described them the way you describe things to someone who will receive them someday. With precision about what matters and brevity about what can be found by looking. He told me where the folder was in the drawer. He told me about the photograph, the garage, the heavy bag, the thinking expression. He told me about the forward notebook entry. He told me about the accounts from the 11 people, and he named the 3 I have told you about, and he told me where the notes for each were in the folder. He told me about the published interview. The quote about the teacher pointing. And then he said, I want you to have it. When the time comes. I said, why me? He thought about this for a moment. He said, because you know how to sit with something before you say it. You learned that. I don't know when you learned it, but you did. And this story needs someone who can sit with it long enough. He looked out at the yard. He said, it took me 30 years. You'll need at least that. Maybe more. I was 34 when he told me this. I am 56 now. I have sat with it. Let me tell you what I found in the folder. I found it 6 weeks after he died, when I was going through his study with my mother, the two of us working through the drawers and the shelves in the careful, slightly suspended way of people doing necessary work in a room where the person who organized everything is gone and the organization is therefore both completely sensible and completely foreign. The folder was where he said it would be. 3rd drawer down, left side, behind a hanging file labeled Tournament Notes 1968 to 1975. Dark green. Slightly worn at the corners. His handwriting on the tab in black ink, just the initials, BL/LB/71. I took it home. I did not open it for 2 weeks.
When I opened it, I found exactly what he had described. The photograph. The notebook pages.
The interview clipping.
The handwritten accounts, his notes from 11 conversations over 30 years, organized chronologically with dates and locations, and the careful shorthand he had used throughout his career. At the back of the folder, behind everything else, was one more thing he hadn't mentioned.
A single index card, unlined, in his handwriting.
The handwriting of someone who wrote the card recently, the letters sharp and deliberate, not the casual handwriting of notes taken in the field, but the considered handwriting of someone who sat down to write something they wanted to be legible for a long time. On the card he had written what Norris knew and said carefully: Lee had not been tested by the standards the world had agreed upon. What Norris knew and didn't say: the standards the world had agreed upon were not adequate to test Lee. What Lee knew and showed in 2 seconds: what he had built was real. What the room knew for 30 seconds: what fighting actually is. What my father's father told him about craftsmen: the best ones always know that what they've built is not the thing itself, it's the best current answer to the question of the thing.
The question is permanent. The answers are temporary. Bruce Lee understood this about fighting before almost anyone else in his world understood it about anything. That's the story. Tell it when you're ready. I sat with that card for a long time. Longer than I sat with anything else in the folder. Longer than the photograph, which I looked at until I felt I understood what my father had understood, the thinking expression, the question being asked of the equipment, the perpetual dissatisfaction that is the engine of genuine development. Longer than the accounts, which I read twice each and which I will tell you are consistent in the ways my father described, the same recognitions, the same vocabulary of inadequacy, not in any of my categories, behind before I started, working from underneath systems, appearing in 11 independent accounts from 11 people who had no reason to coordinate. Longer than the interview clipping, which I read so many times that I know it without reading it now. I want them to stop looking for the answer in the teacher. The teacher can only point. I sat with the index card until I understood what my father was giving me. He was not giving me a story about Bruce Lee. Or not only that. He was giving me the thing the story was about, the question that Lee had asked, the question that my father had spent 30 years trying to answer, the question that the index card was pointing at. What is the thing itself? Not the answer. Not the current best answer. Not the map. The thing the map is trying to describe. And the corollary: how do you know when you've confused the map for the territory? How do you know when the system has become a prison? How do you know when you need to throw out the fence? These are not martial arts questions. They are not questions about fighting or competition or what it means to be an undefeated champion or what it means to develop a system of no fixed techniques. They are questions about how to live. How to hold what you know without letting what you know prevent you from learning what you don't know yet. How to be expert in reading and arrived eventually at a version that felt stable enough to live with. That was his craft. And Bruce Lee's craft was fighting. And the craft, for both of them, was not the content. The craft was the question. The perpetual asking. The refusal to arrive at a final answer and stay there. The willingness to stand in front of the heavy bag in the garage and look at it and ask, what are you, really? What do I need from you that I haven't understood yet? Chuck Norris talked about Bruce Lee publicly many times in the years after Lee's death. The accounts are in the record, interviews, documentary appearances, the memoir he wrote. And what he said, consistently, over the decades, was a version of what my father believed he had said in the corner that October night in Long Beach.
He said Lee was the most extraordinary martial artist he had ever encountered. He said the speed was beyond what he had believed was possible before he encountered it. He said the thinking, the intellectual dimension of Lee's approach, the philosophical depth, was as unusual as the physical capability. He said that their friendship, which was real and which lasted until Lee's death, was one of the significant relationships of his life. He said, in one interview that my father had clipped and kept in a separate file, the things he was working on, he was ahead of his time. Not ahead of his time in the way people say when they mean someone was unusual. Ahead of his time in the way that means the world didn't have the framework yet to understand what he was doing. The framework came later. We're still building it. My father had underlined the last sentence twice. We're still building it. There is a thing that happens when you study someone's life carefully, when you go deep enough into the documents and the accounts and the photographs and the notebooks and the testimony of the people who were present. There is a thing that happens where the person stops being a symbol. This sounds like a loss. It isn't. When the symbol goes, what you get instead is a human being. A specific human being. With specific fears and specific obsessions in specific hours of specific days in specific rooms doing specific work. With a specific sound to their voice when they were explaining something they cared about. With the specific quality of their stillness and the specific quality of their motion. With the specific gap between what they were working toward and what they had achieved on any given day, which, in the case of someone serious, was always a gap, always. Because the serious ones are always behind their own vision of the thing. Bruce Lee at 32 was behind his own vision. He always would have been. That's what the notebooks show, not a man who was approaching completion but a man who understood that completion was not the destination. The destination was the process. The asking. The perpetual updating. He died with the question open. That's not a tragedy. That's what it looks like when the work is real. My father's grave is in a cemetery in the San Fernando Valley. Simple headstone. His name, the dates, and below them his choice, something he arranged before the end, a single line. Not a quote from a famous person. Not a verse. Something he wrote himself in the last months, when he was thinking about what he wanted to remain. It says, he tried to see what was actually there. That's it. That's the whole thing. I stood at the grave the first time and read it and thought, yes. That is the whole thing. For him. For Lee. For Norris in the corner going still. For the man at the service entrance. For Raymond in Seattle learning what speed actually was. For 11 accounts over 30 years all arriving at the same vocabulary of inadequacy before something that exceeded their categories. Trying to see what was actually there. Not what you were trained to see. Not what the system said was there. Not what the rules of the competition defined as there. What was actually? Underneath all of that, irreducibly, permanently, regardless of whether your current framework could describe it. Actually there. The file folder is on my desk as I write this. The photograph. The notebook pages. The interview clipping. The 11 accounts. The index card in my father's careful late handwriting. Tell it when you're ready. I have told it. I don't know if I'm ready. I suspect readiness is not a state you arrive at. I suspect it's another asymptote, something you approach without arriving, something you get close enough to that the gap between you and it is small enough to act across. My father got close enough in 2002, on a September afternoon, in the golden California light. I got close enough now. The question is still open.
What is this, actually? The answer is still provisional. The teacher can only point.
The Long Beach Memorial Arena was demolished in 2005.
A year after my father died.
I don't make anything of that, it's coincidence, and I am not a person who makes meaning of coincidences. I learned that from my father, who spent his career distinguishing between what was actually connected and what only appeared to be connected from the angle you happened to be standing at. But I drove down there when I heard. I drove to Long Beach and I parked and I walked to where the arena had been, and I stood on the sidewalk outside the construction fence and looked at the absence of it.
An arena is a strange thing to be gone.
The size of the absence was unexpected. I had never thought consciously about the volume of the building, the cubic footage of air it contained, but when it was gone I understood suddenly how much space it had been taking up.
The sky was bigger.
The surrounding buildings looked disoriented, as though they had been leaning against the arena and were now recalibrating their balance.
I stood there for maybe 10 minutes. I thought about the back wall.
The spot where my father had stood for an entire evening in October 1971, notebook in hand, watching something that would take him 30 years to understand.
I thought about row 3. I thought about the 6 feet.
I thought about two men in a corner of a building that no longer existed, in a city that had changed beyond recognition since 1971, doing something that left no official record, that was witnessed by one journalist who didn't write it down for 30 years, that lasted perhaps 90 seconds in total. And that was, by my father's account and by everything the file folder contains and by everything I have been able to find in 30 years of sitting with it.
Real. More real than the records. More real than the titles.
More real than the 230 wins and the undefeated championship and the films that 1 billion people have watched. Real in the way that the things are real that happen between two people who have both decided to close the distance and see what is actually there. I drove home on the 405. I thought about my father's hands on the porch chair, very still, holding something carefully.
I thought about the index card.
I thought about the question that is permanent and the answers that are temporary and the asymptote you approach forever without arriving. I thought about a man in a garage in Bel Air in 1970, standing in front of a heavy bag, not hitting it, asking it a question.
What are you, really? What do I need from you that I haven't understood yet?
I drove north through the dark. The freeway noise was the same.
The city was still moving. The question was still open.